Good afternoon to one and all. We welcome you all to the finale day of Anubhav 2021. Today, at this afternoon, we have with us Dr. Swapna Liddle to walk us through the lost monuments of Delhi. Dr. Liddle needs no introduction. However, to sort of do the honors or to do it a formality, I have to introduce Dr. Liddle. Dr. Liddle is a historian with a special interest in Delhi. You'll never find another person who is more apt than Dr. Liddle to talk about Delhi. She's a thesis on cultural and intellectual change in Delhi under the rule of East India Company. And then since then, she has extended her study to the development of Delhi as an imperial capital, particularly under the Mughal and British rule. For many years, she's closely been involved in the movement to preserve historic sites and monuments. Till recently, she was the convener of the Delhi chapter of Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. She's also the author of three books, Connaught Place and the Making of New Delhi, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of Old Delhi, and Delhi 14 historic walks. I welcome you, ma'am, to this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Hemant, and I'm extremely grateful to SpeakMK for inviting me to give this illustrated talk. My connection with SpeakMK goes back several years. And what I have been doing, and यहाँ पे जो सारे schools हैं, colleges हैं, उनको मालूम है जो SpeakMK से जुड़े हुए हैं. मैंने कई walks की हैं दिल्ली में. I have been doing several historic walks in Delhi, and that's the way I usually share my interest in Delhi's monuments with people. But क्या करें? The situation is such that we are now all not able to take groups out to monuments. So this is my way of substituting for that by giving an illustrated talk. But there are some advantages of this also, because through illustrated talks, one can do something that one cannot do in person, which is visit some of the monuments which have now disappeared from Delhi's landscape. So I'm looking forward to sharing this little journey, which I have put together through a few illustrations for you all. And I hope you will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed putting it together and making this little presentation for you. And I look forward to, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I would be very happy to answer any of them. I'm going to share my small PowerPoint presentation that I have of the images that I want to show.
Thank you.
So I'm going to do that.
Ma'am, before that, I'd like to announce that we have with us R.R. Morarka Public School from Dwarkesh Nagar in Bijnor in UP as our host institution for today. We have with us the principal and student representatives from the school who will be interacting with you post the talk. Thank you.
So, the lost monuments of Delhi. Now, one thing I must say that you know, when we talk about monuments, we talk about grand buildings, we talk about you know, things that are tourist attractions. But in this particular talk, I'm going to look at monuments in a rather wider manner. Broadly speaking, you can say these are historic structures. These are historic buildings, heritage buildings, old buildings that are of some historic importance. So my definition of monument here is a little wide. So going on to historic monuments. What are the monuments that we have lost in Delhi? We have a lot already. We have many, many monuments, many, many historic buildings, but some important ones have gone. So this is an exploration of that. Let me move on to my first illustrative example. This is inside the Kutub Minar complex. The Kutub Minar complex, as you all know, the Kutub Minar itself was built after the Turk conquest of Delhi. The armies of Muhammad Ghori under Kutubuddin Aibak conquered North India in the late 12th century, in the 1190s, and Delhi became, very soon, it became their capital city. Now, in the war, they destroyed several temples. Now, that unfortunately was something that used to happen in those days, because one uh, regime trying to overthrow another regime would try to pull down the symbols of that regime or important structures of the power of that regime. And so one of the buildings that was one of the major buildings, it is said that 27 temples of Delhi were destroyed during that conquest war. And one of the buildings was probably the most important of those buildings was a temple that had been built by a rich merchant called Nattal Sahu. Now, Nattal Sahu was not only a rich merchant, he was also politically very influential. He was many of the rulers used to have as their finance ministers, they used to have rich merchants. So he was in an important ministerial position under one of the Tomar rulers, Anubhav II, it is said, in the middle of the 12th century. So, that is one of the important buildings that has been pulled down. So that is one of the earliest buildings that we know existed but is now not there. That and the other 27 temples. However, the pillars of those temples were then later reused to build the main congregational mosque of the Turks who had conquered Delhi. So the Jami Masjid, which is next to the Qutub Minar, is built of some of those pillars have been reused in its construction. And my photo here shows some of those pillars. So this is one of the lost monuments of Delhi, the large temple built by Nattal Sahu, which is evident only in some of the pillars that have remained. So that is it's interesting to see that when the Turks destroyed this temple, they also left some of the other temples which were not associated with such politically powerful figures. So, for instance, the temple of Jogmaya, the Dadabadi Jain Mandir, these were left because these were not associated with political figures. These were associated with the common people, and therefore these were not destroyed. So this was it was a Jain temple, by the way. So let's move on to my next slide. Now, when we are talking about destruction, the destruction of the temples was a political act, damaging the political power and influence of rich people and powerful people like Nattal Sahu and their masters who were the political. Of course, by this time the Tomars had been replaced by the Chauhans, but still. So that was the idea. But the reuse of those temple pillars in making of the mosque had some very practical motives also, because cutting stone is not easy. So if you have to build a huge big mosque where you have to make lots and lots of pillars, then you have to cut so much stone, it will take a very, very long time. So they thought that as a practical necessity, it was a good idea to reuse those temple pillars. So a lot of that material was reused in the making of the mosque. The idea of reuse actually has existed in Delhi for a long, long time. So, we are all told that in Delhi, there have been seven different cities that have been, from the beginning, whether it is the Lal Kot, which is Mehroli, which is the area around the Qutub Minar, which the Turks had conquered, whether it is that, or later it is Siri, or it's Tughlakabad, there's a place called Kilokri, Jahanpana, Shahjahanabad, Shergarh, Jahanpana, there are many, many, right? They say seven, but actually there are more than seven cities which have come and gone in Delhi. So what has happened is, now the reason why new cities were built were for various reasons. Sometimes it was a political reason. It is said that Jalaluddin Khilji decided that the old city was very, had too many people who were of the rival factions of the opposing political party. So he decided that he will be crowned in another city. So he made his capital Kilokri or Kilugadi. So that happened. Sometimes it was due to other reasons like wanting to be close to the river. So Firoz Shah Tughlaq decided to build the capital near the Yamuna River in Firozabad, which is now Firoz Shah Kotla, incidentally. And similarly, defensive reasons. So Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq decided to build a huge fortress on Tughlaqabad because it was defensively, it was very, very strong. So they were building capitals for different reasons. But every time they built a new capital, they often reuse the materials of older capitals. So, for instance, you had this, you see the buildings here. These are buildings in front of Firoz Shah Kotla. Firoz Shah Kotla, as I said, city of Firozabad. Now, these you will not see anymore. These are missing. And the reason they are missing is this painting was painted in the late 18th century. But in the early 19th century, the British East India Company started ruling Delhi, and they decided to strengthen the city wall of Shahjahanabad. Now, Shahjahanabad, this is the sort of an aerial view of Shahjahanabad. This was, of course, the 17th century city. This had been there earlier also. Shah Jahan had built this city, but the British now in the 19th century started ruling from here. They started ruling Delhi from here, even though their actual capital in India was Calcutta, but they started, they were ruling Delhi. So they decided to re-strengthen the wall of the city, and they rebuilt the wall. You can see the walls, you can see the wall all over this place, around surrounding the city. So they decided to rebuild the wall. And what did they do? Again, because it was just easy and pragmatic, they pulled down some of these neighboring buildings. At Firoz Shah Kotla, if you're familiar with Delhi, you will realize it's quite close to Shahjahanabad. So all these old buildings that were there, they pulled down the stones of those buildings and used them to build the wall. So this kind of recycling actually has been happening not only in the British period, but much earlier also. So for instance, Sher Shah Suri built a city called Shergarh around Purana Kila. And what he did was he sent his builders to the older city of Siri, which is near present what we call Siri, that area. Of that city to come and to bring them here and build Shergarh. So this kind of recycling has been happening throughout Delhi's history, and that's the reason why many of the older cities are actually not to be found, or very few of their remains are to be found. And as I said, we can see even till quite late in the 17th century, you can see these very grand monuments which people painted, but today we can't see them because they have disappeared. It was not only rulers building new cities who recycle the stones of older ones. Many of the monuments that have existed in the past, for some reason, they were no longer being used, and their materials were then reused by the neighboring communities. People who were living around these monuments have used their stones to build their houses, build their markets, whatever they were building, they built them out of these reused materials. As I said, this is a form of recycling, not so as to save money and labor that is involved in buying the stone, cutting it to shape, etc. So this is just an example I am showing of a sarai gateway. We don't know which sarai this is. It's not named in this picture, but in Delhi, you see, there are many place names which are called this sarai and that sarai. So there's Sarai Julena, there is Sarai People Thalla, there is Ber Sarai, Yusuf Sarai, many sarais. There are many place names which are named after sarais, and when you go there, you find that there is no sarai. Sarai kahan gayi? But the sarais have often disappeared because they stopped being used, and the gateways, etc., which were there, were pulled down, and their material was used by the people who were living in that area to build their own houses. So that's how the buildings have all disappeared. So it's the rulers who are building new cities. There are common people who are living in that area who are reusing the cities. That's been one of the reasons for the disappearance of some of these structures. Now you will look, and I think you can recognize this. This is Kutub Minar. And Qutub Minar, of course, is very much still there. So you're wondering why I have put this up. But the reason is that there are some elements of some buildings which have disappeared. Now, if we look at this Qutub Minar, particularly at the top a little more closely, you will see that on top of the 5 stories, there was a 6th small story. It's a small, like a chhatri or a cupola. This little chhatri that you see on top, this was painted by a very famous painter, Thomas Daniel, in the 1790s. Now, this was, he painted this, but a few years later, in 1803, there was an earthquake in Delhi. Delhi has been earthquake prone, of course, as we all know who have lived in Delhi, that from time to time there are earthquakes here. And this earthquake actually damaged this chhatri very badly. It completely crumbled and broke down. So a few years later, in the 1820s, the British East India Company, as I said, that British East India Company had started ruling Delhi from 1803. And at that time, they decided to do repairs to the Qutub Minar. And at that period, the person who was in charge of the repairs was one major, he was an army engineer. He was called Major Smith, Major Robert Smith. And Major Robert Smith designed a chhatri of his own to put on top of the Qutub Minar. And this is what it looked like. So this is a painting. You can see the chhatri on top of it. You can't see it very well, but I will show you a better view very shortly. What happened with this chhatri was that it was built in a style which was really not harmonious with the older style. It looked very incongruous with the older style. So a lot of people criticized it and said that it's not looking nice. So therefore, in very soon after, maybe only 20 years it had stood there, when somebody said, please take it down. One governor general who was passing by, he said that please take it down, it's not looking good. So they took it down. And they took it down and they placed it on a green patch of land close to the Qutub Minar. In fact, today also you can see it, and you can see, this is my photo, a photograph I have taken of it. This is the chhatri. It's called Major Smith's Folly. If you visited the Qutub Minar, you might have seen this. So this used to stand on top of the Qutub Minar. So it's not lost, but it has lost its original space, which it used to be in. And the Qutub Minar has lost an element which was temporarily there. And of course, no other chhatri has been put on top of it. It is completely now, it ends at 5 stories. Now, all you have at top is a lightning conductor, which is very essential to make sure that lightning strikes don't happen there. And of course, there is a light there, which is a guide for aeroplanes, to warn aeroplanes that there's a building at that level. So we have, this is what the Qutub Minar is like now, no chhatri on top of it. Other buildings have changed due to natural changes in the natural environment. Now, these are buildings, these are ghats. Now, in Delhi, we are not familiar, our river is unlike other major cities which are beside the river, like whether it is Varanasi or it is Mathura, which have a riverside culture with the ghats. Now, we don't realize it, but Delhi had it too. Delhi had major ghats beside the river. And this is a middle of the 19th century picture of some of those ghats. This is Bashri Ghat. And there were these ghats which are beside the river. The Nigambodh was a major ghat. So the areas still bear those names, but the ghats, the actual buildings now have mostly disappeared. There's hardly anything left. So therefore, these have disappeared. Now, why have they disappeared? We must realize that it's a natural phenomenon to a large extent, because the river has changed its course. These ghats were very close to the city of Shahjahanabad, which we call Purani Delhi. They were very close there. Now, if you look back again at that map that I had showed earlier, if you look on the left side of this map, you will see that beside the wall of the city, this area where the Red Fort is, there is a river flowing beside that. Now, this is the place where those who are familiar with Delhi will know that this is where the ring road now runs. So the river has gone. The river has changed its course. Now, what happens with rivers? Though I'm sure you have studied in your geography lessons, that particularly in the plains areas, and we are by the time you come to Delhi, there's the start of the Ganga Yamuna Doab, that very flat area, that plain area. Rivers tend to change their course from time to time. They become very sluggish and they deposit their silt, and the deposition of silt leads to sometimes to the changing of course of rivers. So this river has changed its course. Now it is not there where it was when this map was made in the middle of the 19th century. It has moved away. It has moved further to the westwards. It has moved westwards, and therefore that land has been left empty. And if you don't have a river, then you don't need a ghat, because ghat is to access the river, to go down to the river, to bathe in the river. Now, if there is no river, then you don't need those elaborate ghats anymore. So many of those buildings have fallen to disuse, and therefore, as I said, they have disappeared because the materials have been recycled also. Another thing that has now disappeared is there used to be, for a long time, there were no built bridges across the rivers. So a river like the Yamuna, which was very, very wide, it was very difficult to cross it. And they did not have the technology to build pakka bridges across them. They used to build bridges of boats. So boats used to be tied together and a bridge used to be built. This is a photograph of the old bridge of boats. This was a bridge of boats that was built across the Yamuna. It used to be very close to where the later Lohe Ka Pul came up. That Lohe Ka Pul is of course still there, the railway bridge, which is really very close to the Red Fort. It goes from Salimgarh, which is north of Red Fort, across the river. So before that bridge came up, there was this bridge of boats. So these are some of the, if it was still there, it would be called industrial heritage. The Lohe Ka Pul is now industrial heritage because that's a utilitarian, it's a technological structure which was built at a particular era of time. It demonstrates the technology of that time. The bridge of boats demonstrates the technology of crossing rivers during Mughal times and later also during the early colonial period. So the Mughals also used bridge of boats. In some of the older miniatures, you can see bridges of boats illustrated. So this is a bridge of boats, which has also disappeared. The other thing that has disappeared really are some of the waterways of Delhi. Some of them were man-made. So you can think of them also as monuments. This is an old photograph, one of the early, probably the earliest photograph of Chandni Chowk. This is looking from the Lahore Gate of the fort. If you're standing on top of the gate and you're looking down Chandni Chowk, you could in those days see a channel of water right in the middle. You can see the channel of water, you can see shady trees there also. That channel of water used to be fed from a canal which used to come higher up from the Yamuna. Now, over the years, definitely from the mid 19th century, late 19th century, this canal started drying up, and therefore the water supply became very sporadic and it completely dried up. So what they did was they completely finished that channel of water. It was closed up. So we don't see this anymore. But this photograph and other paintings, etc., are evidence that this was what the channel used to look like at this time. Now, the political or other reasons for getting rid of monuments and sometimes bringing them back did not finish with the Turk invasion. From time to time, it has happened. Now, Shah Jahan, when he built the city of Shahjahanabad, which we call Purani Delhi now, he had placed two large stone elephants by the gates. I think they were in front of the Lahore Gate, if I'm not mistaken, or it may have been Delhi Gate. There are two major gates of Shahjahan, of the Red Fort in Delhi. But what happens is that the evidence on this, the travelers' accounts, etc., are a little ambiguous on which side the elephants were. But there were definitely two large elephants which were placed there. Now, when Aurangzeb came to the throne, Aurangzeb had a somewhat conservative and orthodox view as far as the building of images of human beings or elephants, etc., of animals, etc., was concerned. He considered it un-Islamic because it was too close to building idols for worship. So what he did was he decided that he would have these removed. The sculptures were of two elephants with riders on top of them. So what he did was he had them removed. And they disappeared. Nobody knew where they were, but they were rediscovered after 1857. 1857, as we all know, there was a revolt in Delhi and large parts of North India. I'm interested that Bijnor, the host school today is from Bijnor, because Bijnor was a very important center of that revolt. In fact, later Sir Syed Ahmad Khan wrote a very important text called Sarkashe-Zila Bijnor. You might want to read that sometime if you haven't read it. So during the revolt, after the revolt was suppressed, the Red Fort, the Mughal, as you know, that the Mughal emperor and some of his close family members were exiled. Many of the Mughal royal family were actually executed also, and they were all thrown out of the Red Fort, which used to be their home. And the Red Fort was occupied by the British Army. And the British Army destroyed many of the buildings of the Red Fort. In fact, I'll come to that in a little while. And what happened was they rediscovered in the fort at that time the pieces of the old elephants. Some of the pieces, they didn't find all of them, they found some of them. And of the pieces that they found, they assembled them and put them together in front of the town hall in the city which they were rebuilding. So this is the rebuilt elephant. It has not been built very well. It is a patchwork. You can see it's like literally, as I said, the stones that they had found, they just put together, assembled them together somehow and stuck them together and they put it there. Now, later what happened was that Lord Curzon, who was the viceroy in the early 20th century, he decided that he wanted those elephants back in front of the Red Fort. Now, at that stage, they said that, look, we only found enough pieces to make one elephant, and that elephant also doesn't look great. So what should we do? So what he said was, carve new elephants. So new elephants were carved, and these are the elephants now that stand in front of the Delhi gate of the Red Fort. Now, unfortunately, this is not a gate that most of us see, because this is usually kept locked. Tourists usually enter from the what is known as the Lahore Gate. So therefore, we don't get to see these elephants, but these life-size elephants are still there in front of the gate. Now, as I said, that I'm not talking only about grand monuments. I'm talking about any kind of old buildings. Now, the area between this view that you see in this sketch was also drawn sometime in the 1840s by some Russian traveler called Saltykov. And what he shows is a view from the Red Fort towards the Jama Masjid. Now you see all that area in between the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid had a lot of buildings in it. It had a lot of buildings, many bazaars, houses, etc. were in that area. It was quite well populated. It also, of course, had a lot of greenery. It had a lot of trees, etc. And after the revolt happened in 1857, the British decided that they would clear all this away. They would demolish all the buildings. They would cut down all the trees. They would make it absolutely bare because they wanted security around the fort. They felt that nobody should be able to take shelter in a building or behind a tree or on a tree and shoot from there towards the Red Fort. So they needed a clear line of fire 500 yards around the Red Fort. So all these buildings were demolished. And you can see this is a photograph which is taken about 100 years ago now. So in the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see that how that area had changed. All the buildings mostly which had been between the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid were now destroyed. The trees that you see many had been recently replanted. For a long time, it was absolutely bare. By this time, some of the trees had started being planted. So a lot of the buildings that have disappeared over the time are not grand monuments, but they would have been good examples of the architecture of a particular era, which have now gone. Of course, there were more important buildings that were demolished also during this clearance. One of the buildings that had stood in this area was the Akbarabadi Masjid. The Akbarabadi Masjid is probably only the second in importance in Shahjahanabad after the Jama Masjid. Akbarabadi Masjid was built by one of the wives of Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan had 4 wives. By the time he came to Delhi, Mumtaz Mahal had already died, but the other 3 were alive, and each of those wives built one mosque in Delhi. So this is one of the wives. She, Akbarabadi Begum, she was called. She was also called Aisabadi Begum, and she built this mosque, which was. There is a Sunehri Masjid next to the Red Fort. This is not very far from. This was not very far from that, but the British decided to demolish it. So really, all that we have left are some sketches like this one, which had appeared in a book in 1840. This book was also written by Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan. It was called Asarus Sanadid. So this is from that book. The British also destroyed a lot of buildings, other buildings after 1857, which were landmarks of the city. So one of the landmarks was Chandni Chowk. Now, today we call that whole road in front of, which goes from Red Fort towards Fatehpuri Masjid, we call that whole road Chandni Chowk. Very often we call that whole area Chandni Chowk. But actually Chandni Chowk was just a chalk. Chalk meaning a square, right, where roads intersect. So this was a chalk. It was a big chalk. It was 8-sided, and it had this building in it. This grand gateway, which used to lead into a garden and a sarai where mostly foreign traders, etc., used to come and stay. This was built by Jahanara Begum, the daughter of Shah Jahan. So Chandni Chowk, it was called Chandni Chowk. In the middle of this painting, you can also see in front of that gateway a pool, a little hawse. And that pool used to have obviously water in it, and the water used to reflect the moonlight, and therefore Chandni, and therefore Chandni Chowk. So this was Chandni Chowk. Chandni Chowk was also demolished. Chandni Chowk was demolished, the sarai was demolished, all the buildings around this. So the Chowk had this gateway, it had all these shops that you can see on either side of the gateway. All these were demolished, and the British put up another building of their own, and that building was the clock tower, right in the middle of that chalk. They built other buildings also, like the town hall. But the reason I'm talking about the clock tower is that this clock tower has itself become one of the lost monuments of Delhi, because this also later crumbled down. It was built in the 1860s, but its structure was such, architecture was such that it was very tall and thin, and therefore probably not very stable. And there are conflicting ideas about this. Some say that it was an earthquake or something. In the 1950s, it came down. It came crashing down, and therefore, again, is listed in our list of lost monuments. The British had also demolished, as I said earlier, had demolished a lot of buildings inside the Red Fort. Now, if you look at this view of the Red Fort from the river, you can see a lot of buildings over the walls, the red sandstone walls, and above them there are a lot of buildings. Most of these buildings were demolished. Today, if you see that same view, you will not see many of those buildings. You will see the Diwan Khas, you will see the Hammam, the Burj, you will see this Musamman Burj in the middle, but many of the buildings have disappeared. They have gone. In fact, if you look at older paintings like this one from the 1840s, you see how many buildings were inside the Red Fort. It was quite crowded by this time. This was a area in the middle of the Red Fort, which was known as No Mohalla. This had been built fairly recently, before the revolt, and therefore you see so many houses there. So all these buildings were demolished by the British after the revolt of 1857. And today, when you go to the Red Fort, you often see large open spaces of green area. That was not there. There were many, many buildings there which have been lost. Also, among the buildings that remained, their face changed. They started looking different because now when we see these buildings, this is the Diwan-e-Khas in the Red Fort. If you don't remember what the Diwan-e-Khas looks like, if you haven't seen it, please Google it. Look at one of the photographs of the Diwan-e-Khas of the Red Fort in Delhi, which will come up. It looks very different from this, because this shows when it used to be used, how much furnishing it had. It had this red, they had the red awnings, they had red kanats, they had red pardas, which kind of gave shelter to it. When you get inside the Diwan-e-Khas, it had beautiful carpets. There was gilding. There was a lot of gold paint on the insides. Much of that was later destroyed by the British. So what happened was that these buildings, though they are not lost in that sense, they are still there, but they are profoundly changed because various elements of them have been lost, like the furnishings and the finishings are lost. So therefore, they look very, very different. The other buildings that were lost in Shahjahanabad were lost after some years, and they were lost because of development. Now, what happened was that they decided that the city was getting more populated, more space was needed, and one of the things that they started doing was started demolishing the walls of the city. So in some areas, the walls were demolished, and with it, the gates went. Now, again, the gates are one aspect that we which are left only in name, some of them. Some of the gates are actually there still in Shahjahanabad, like the Kashmiri Gate is still there, Lahore Gate is still, not Lahore Gate, Kashmiri Gate is still there, Delhi Gate is still there, Turkoman Gate is still there, Ajmeri Gate is still there. But many gates have been destroyed. They remain only in name. The actual gate is not there. So this is Mori Gate. You see further, at the far end of the picture, it shows a gateway there. That is Mori Gate. So that Mori Gate was demolished. It is no longer there. Another gate that disappeared forever was Lahore Gate. Lahore Gate also, the name is still there. There's a market in that area. If you go to Delhi, Khari Baoli, you go to Khari Baoli, a little beyond Khari Baoli, you'll see that the area is called Lahore Gate. Now, this is an old photograph from 1857. It shows Lahore Gate, but this gate, as I said, was later demolished, and really we don't have any evidence of it. Another building that can be categorized as a lost monument is this one. It's called Dil Kusha. Dil Kusha is a very interesting monument because actually it was a tomb of the 16th or 16th century. Sorry, for a historian, I'm really bad at dates. I find it very difficult to navigate it. This is early 17th century. This is the tomb of Kulikhan. It was the tomb of Kulikhan. Kulikhan was a brother of Adham Khan. Adham Khan, if you remember, was the foster brother of Akbar. And Akbar had him killed because he had assassinated some other person. So Akbar had him killed. And actually, in this photograph, in the distance towards the right, you can see Adham Khan's tomb also. But the one which is closer to us in this painting shows in the middle the dome of Kuli Khan's tomb. Kuli Khan is the brother. Now, in the 19th century, in the 1840s, one of the administrators of Delhi, Thomas Metcalfe, he was the commissioner of Delhi. In those days, the commissioner was the very highest government official in Delhi. And Thomas Metcalfe converted the tomb into a house. So he built this whole, the cream colored structure that you see around the grey tomb, that is all the building that was, the construction that was made around the tomb by Thomas Metcalfe. And he called this Dil Kusha, the name of the building he gave Dil Kusha. It became a sort of like a weekend home for him. He used to come here during the weekends with his family and used to relax here. It's very close to the Kutub Minar, so it's quite beautiful also. It has a beautiful view of the Kutub Minar from here also. But later, of course, in 1857, this was looted. And later, when the Archaeological Survey of India started looking at these monuments, what they did was they removed those outer walls and additions that had been made by Thomas Metcalfe to reveal the original tomb. And this photograph shows you what it looks like these days. They have removed most of the outer walls. So now you can see the original tomb of Kulikhan. They have left a little bit of the walls of Dil Kusha. which Thomas Metcalfe had added, so that you get an idea of what the tomb would have looked like when it was Dilkusha. So we have lost one monument, which is Dilkusha, but we have regained an older monument, which is Kulikhan's tomb. Not strictly a monument, but I thought that this would be something that you would find interesting. This is Raisina Hill. Now, Raisina Hill, of course, is a natural feature. It was a little hill which was flattened in order to make Rashtrapati Bhavan and the Secretariat buildings, North Block and South Block. Now, this was because they were building a city of New Delhi. The British in the 1911 decided that they wanted to shift the capital from Calcutta to Delhi, and they started building in Delhi a big grand capital city, which later came to be known as New Delhi. And this was Raisina Hill, which existed here, which was flattened to make that particular, it's still called Raisina Hill, of course, but it doesn't look anything like this because the natural feature was kind of cut down and it was built upon. So I thought it would be nice to look at the lost Raisina Hill as opposed to the present day Raisina Hill. The construction of this new city was also a period when a lot of the monuments that were surviving from the older cities were cleared away. So this huge building, this is it's a painting of Purana Killa in Delhi. And some of you may be familiar with Purana Killa. In front of it, you see this huge building, which is there in the foreground. This is not there anymore. But this was there, and this was one of the many buildings that were cleared away to make New Delhi. These were all demolished and New Delhi was created. And these buildings were, their materials, again, the recycling was still going on. So the materials of these buildings were used to make the foundations of the buildings of New Delhi, make the roads, etc. So a lot of recycling was still considered. A lot of the buildings that were cleared away for New Delhi were not monumental in the sense they were not very important or very grand, but they were the homes of people who lived there. This is Lodi Garden, and you can see the huts in the foreground. So when they were removing them, they left the grand tombs. They left the grand tombs, but the smaller buildings, the huts were all removed. This was a village which was called Khairpur. The village of Khairpur was removed, and all the buildings were demolished. And this was landscaped into the park that we today know as Lodi Garden. There were a lot, and it was not just huts. There were other buildings also which were in this area. This is, in the background, you see the dome of Humayun's tomb, right along the horizon there. In front are all the buildings which were in a locality in the Humayun's tomb complex called Arab Sarai. So you see all the buildings of Arab Sarai. These were not huts. There were one or two huts, but there were also bigger complexes, havelis, and these were all demolished to beautify the place when the city of New Delhi was being built in the early part of the 20th century. So we have lost. Now, you may ask, is this a loss? Are we losing something when we lose buildings like this as opposed to grand monuments? And yes, there is some amount of loss because we have lost evidence of what the common people used to build in those days. If we had an idea of what the kind of structures which common people built, how they built their homes and huts, it would be a very valuable heritage resource for us, but we have lost it. This is just a picture to show you what the area around Humayun's tomb used to look like. When we look at maps, it is another thing altogether. And I wanted to show this particular map, and I hope you can see it properly, because you will see many, many blue dots here. And the blue dots all are, and this is a map from early 20th century, before the city of New Delhi was built. And all these blue dots represent wells. There were many, many wells in the countryside. They were used for water, of course, for drinking purposes, for irrigation purposes, etc. So a lot of those wells, of course, were closed up when the city of New Delhi was built. Water supply was piped, and therefore a lot of the old wells were permanently sealed. So just to give you a sense of the number of wells that we have lost also. just as a matter of interest. We have continued to lose buildings. It is not just moments like the building of a new city. We, through our apathy, through our deliberate neglect, uh, desire to redevelop real estate, we are continuously losing buildings. So this is something called Lal Mahal. It is near Nizamuddin. Over the years, this is a very important structure. It dates from Khalji times, from very early times, and slowly it has been disappearing. This is a 100-year-old photograph. Now you can't even take a photograph there anymore because it is completely barricaded, and probably if most of the structure has probably now disappeared altogether. You can't see it anymore. This is a building that is lost. It was called Ludlow Castle. Ludlow Castle was built as a house by one Dr. Ludlow in the early part of the 19th century. He lived there for a long time. It was also the residence of the commissioner of Delhi, but it was then later it became a school. And in fact, Ludlow Castle School, the name is still there, even though the building has been demolished. The original building has been demolished and a new building was built. But the name Ludlow Castle School still remains. But this is the original Ludlow Castle. This is the Kotwali, the Delhi police station in the city of Shahjahanabad, in Purani Delhi, in Old Delhi. This was the Kotwali, the main police station. And one of the chalks in which it stood was called Kotwali Chowk. That Kotwali Chowk, because the Kotwali disappeared, is now called Phavara Chowk because there's a fountain in the middle of it. But Kotwali Chowk, this was the Mughal era building. Then the British in the early part of the 20th century built a new building. And you can see this. This is a colonial British kind of structure. But later this building also was demolished. And now at this spot, there is no Kotwali, but there is an ancillary building of the Gurdwara Seesganj. So it's not the Gurdwara, but another building which has a parking lot in the middle, under it. So that building is there on this spot. If you look at old photographs of Shahjahanabad, you will see many, many wonderful Havelis. This is one of them. The next one photograph that you see many other buildings. What has happened is we have lost these over the years. Many, many very beautiful buildings which would have given a very different look to Chandni Chowk have now gone. And even those that survive are now slowly being lost to a very modern glass and steel structures, some of them coming up. Some of them are very ugly structures also and are not suited to that area. So we are continuing to lose architecture. And really the last thing that I will talk about here is something that we have lost, a major monument which we have lost lately, which is the Hall of Nations. This was built in the 1970s. It was built in post-independence India as a major monument to the growing nation, to the industrializing nation, to the forward-looking nation. And it was, as those of you who remember Pragati Maidan and the Hall of Nations will remember, it was an exhibition site. It was a site for recreation. All sorts of things used to happen here. And this was demolished very, very recently, just a few years ago. So what is happening is that we are ourselves destroying large parts of our heritage. And I think it is time to revisit some of these things, to talk about what goes, why it goes. Is post-independence architecture even heritage? Is something of the 1970s, can we consider it heritage at all? Why not? And why should we? And what does it stand for? So that is really the last point that I will make here. And if there are questions, I will, of course, be very happy to answer any of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It's sure for those who've been in Delhi also, the walkthrough that we've been in through the lost monuments by various reasons. I'm sure every single slide had a large amount of takeaways for people to go back and do homeworks. To the audience and YouTube, you're most welcome to post your questions on YouTube. We'll be sharing it with ma'am. Ma'am, before that, I have a question. You mentioned about various gates. in the Shah Jahanabad, we have gates in Kila Rai Pitoda in the first city of Delhi, Khuni Darwaza, that is in the Firozabad. Each of these gates had a certain commemoration or certain intent, or if nothing, these gates today are surrounded by buildings, have lost its grandeur. Uh, though it physically exists, it's as good as people not knowing about it. You see Guni Darwaza right in the middle of the road, but nobody notices it. You just pass by Mamsi or a Firosha Kotla. It's just a random stone structure there. Uh, so rather than physically being taken away from our sight, the way in which we are moving to a time where we are sort of forgetting these monuments in the process of, whatever the reason might be, isn't that also amounting to those structures being lost?
That's a very good statement, and I understand what you are saying there. And I agree with you. We often don't notice these buildings at all in our you know in our consciousness as we are maybe going down that road, Bahadur Shah Zafar Marg, on which Kuni Darwaza stands. And I think it's a very simple thing of city planning. If that area, that it's a little island in the middle of the road, if it was only landscaped a little differently, that it was in an inviting small park where people could sit and relax, I think people's views of that would change very drastically. Sometimes it's a question of how we highlight our monuments. And by highlighting, I don't mean putting lights on them necessarily, but it's just how we landscape the area around it, how we design the area around it, the streetscape, the street furniture, etc., to highlight that monument. I think that's a failure of our town planning, that we haven't done it.
Absolutely, ma'am. I see that somebody has mentioned about the lost duck wells or the Baolis. We have a lot of Baolis that are lost. Even within the Firosha Kotla, if we see that there's a Bawli, but nobody really knows about what's there because of restrictions and all that. So people were asking if you could throw light on the lost Bawlis too. In a
Actually, the Baolis are pretty much there, though some of them are very difficult to find. I don't know whether there are any traces of Khari Baoli still left. Because Khari Baoli is a very important, it gives the name to that area. And it used to be a brackish Baoli, a step well, but there are no signs of it. But we know of many Baolis which are still extant in Delhi and are there. That Agrasen ki Baoli became very popular because of featuring in a film, etc. So they are very much there. I think the aspect that is lost in the Baolis is actually the water. Because our water table has fallen so much, we have ruined the catchment areas, the ecological network, water system of the city is completely ruined, and therefore there is no water in these Baolis. I think that is the greater loss there. That there's no hope of reviving water systems until the underlying problem of a low water table and a contaminated, polluted water table is not sorted out. So that, unfortunately, that is the main way in which a Baoli is lost.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Another question is, compared to the times that we've been in the British era, when there was a transition from one era to the other, and we see another set of moving to a democratic era, from an imperial era to a democratic era when we moved, what difference did you as an historian notice in terms of developing or developing without uh, compromising on conservation of heritage? What stark difference have you as a historian noticed?
Well, first of all, the difference, say, I've said a lot about how the British destroyed parts of Shahjahanabad and rebuilt it in colonial, for instance, Chandni Chowk was destroyed and replaced with the clock tower and the town hall. Now, when we got independence in 1947, our political leaders, I think, were much more pragmatic about it. They thought that, instead of demolishing government house, viceroy's house, instead of demolishing the secretariats, they can reuse them. So they decided that viceroy's house now becomes president's house. The secretariats continue to function as secretariats because the new independent nation also needs government buildings, right? So they continue to use them. So that political statement making was not so much. So so all these buildings remained and their importance remained. But of course, they when they built their own structures, they built them in other places. Like as I said, there was a the new monuments to the nation were buildings like Hall of Nations, which were not palaces, which were not religious structures, but these were modern, which were for a modern nation, for modern functions, for a modern democracy. So these were different kinds of institutions that were being built. So they added them. I think what happened as far as our heritage is concerned, that we took it for granted and we kind of neglected it. We didn't think that we needed to do very much to protect it because ye to rahega hi, because it stayed for so long. And therefore, I think we have neglected places like Shahjahanabad, which as I showed you, we have lost so many and continue to lose so many old buildings because we have not thought comprehensively about how to protect heritage areas. So I think that is what has happened rather than any deliberate attempt to erase that heritage. Is just neglect and apathy.
Yes, ma'am. And a follow-up question to that with one particular example. Railway has always been part of India's heritage with respect to, we can see the Ring Road railways or even the British era railways, which in turn, we no longer can see the Great Wall of Shahjahanabad because it was demolished for the New Delhi railway station and Old Delhi railway line. So when such developments happen, um, what sort of dilemma, as maybe like public policy makers out there, what sort of dilemma would they have to take? At one point they have something to do like railways. At another side, they're supposed to conserve heritage. So weighing them is really a tedious task. Uh, if we can draw parallels to the modern time as well. So, what are your views on that?
Answers can always be found. When a government says we can't do this, you must always ask them questions a little further, because when you ask more questions, you sometimes get the answer that it will be expensive to do, not that it can't be done. So look at this. The metro network came up in Delhi, but in Shahjahanabad, the metro network is underground. In New Delhi, the metro network is underground. It costs more money to put it underground. It is not that it cannot be done. So if you look hard enough, you can find the answers. If you have a commitment to preserving heritage. If you have a commitment to preserving heritage, you will find other ways of doing things. You will find another place of land. You don't have to build that flyover right next to a major monument. You don't have to clear away old structures. If it depends on what your priorities are. If they really are important to you, then you will find another way.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is, could you tell us the scattered monuments that we see in Malvi Nagar, Chirag, Delhi, Horse Rani, Horse Cars, Cheer Minar, etc.? We always see them, but not be able to understand or decipher them. And also about the archaeological park around Kutub Minar.
Yes. Delhi, of course, has a wealth of old structures. All the old cities, many of what is left behind are the monumental mosques and tombs and graveyards, etc. There's a lot of it there. Yes, I think signage is a very important role to play there. If you have good signage, then anybody going in there can read the story of those monuments. A lot of it was done in, I think, 2010, just before the Commonwealth Games happened. There was a comprehensive project of putting the signage there. I was at that time, in fact, writing a lot of that signage for Intact. So if you go to Horse Khas and all that, the signage that you see there was all written by me. Firoz Shah Kotla, Horse Khas, Purana Kila, all that signage was actually written by me also. So we did put up a lot of signage, but as I agree, there can be more signage. Delhi, we have had a very good experience with the popularization of heritage walks, many books being written about the city and its neighborhoods, etc. There is an interest, at least in these kind of monuments. It is there. So my next step, I would say, is that we should be looking more at other places. What about Bijnor, for instance? Can the school children go out and document the heritage that is around them, try to find out what are the stories of the buildings? And remember, don't only think about monuments, think about houses, think about chalks, think about public spaces in the city, in the town, in the villages around. I think we have to be moving beyond what we think of conventionally as monuments and looking at heritage in many, many different aspects around us and documenting it. And school is an excellent way to begin.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think the students of the school have some questions. Why don't we ask Sarvagya Agarwal from RRMPS to ask this question? You may mute and unmute and open your video, Sarvagya.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, I am Sarvagya Agrawal of class 12th from RR Murarka Public School, Dwarikesh Nagar, District Bijnor. Firstly, let me say, ma'am, this is one of the most terrific sessions I have ever attended. Thank you so much for this wonderful session.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am, as we see, there is no discussion of the lost monuments in the media or books. So my question to you is, what's the main reason behind this?
Well, the thing is that very often you will realize that it's because they are lost and people don't even know that they existed. Sometimes that happens a long time ago, particularly things that have disappeared a long time ago. So people just don't know about it. So therefore there is no discussion. At other times, I find it very funny that at least, it's a question of growing awareness, that the people have the idea that these are important buildings which should not have disappeared. So every time you have, whether Monuments Day or something comes around, it is commemorated once a year. And every time there's a parliament question is asked that what has happened to the missing monuments of Delhi, because there are some Archaeological Survey of India monuments in the list which now are not traceable, because they have disappeared over the years. So there is this kind of token questions that are asked in parliament, etc. So it happens. So therefore, there is not enough awareness, I think. But I think the main question simply is that those that have disappeared, now it's a question of academic interest, because you can't bring them back. You cannot bring old monuments back. That which is gone is gone. I think we should concentrate our energies on preserving what we still have and looking after that, and identifying in places where we haven't identified them. So that's my answer to that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sarvagya. Is there anybody else from the school? Purva Sharma, would you like to ask a question?
Yes. Good afternoon, ma'am. This is Purva Sharma from class 10 from Anubhav Public School, Dwarikesh Nagar, District Bijnor. Ma'am, my question is, how are human
Purva, can you please ask the question again? Actually, you lost your connection.
human activities harming our historical monuments?
Yeah, our human activities are harming our. First of all, we don't see the relevance of. We don't value our heritage buildings. That happens, and I'm talking about monuments as well as the buildings which are old and which we live in also. Sometimes we don't know how to look after them. So that is one reason we don't. For instance, if it's an old building which is made of brick and lime and that kind of water, we put cement on it, we put modern tiles on it, and that damages the building. That happens. As far as monuments are concerned, the usual problems, littering, etc. happens. People don't. I think the main answer is greater awareness. And greater awareness only comes when you understand more, when you read more, when you look more, when you appreciate that monuments are also a part of our society and economy. And economy is very important because we must realize that there can be heritage can coexist with development. A lot of people think that development means you wipe out heritage. Heritage is a burden. Heritage is a burden, and you can either have development or you can have heritage. You can't have both. Whereas if we look carefully, we can have development with heritage, development which is led by heritage also, because heritage is a very important asset we have. It's a very important economic asset for our society and for individuals also. And I think there are many other countries, even parts of our own country, which have realized this a lot better and have built up tourism, etc., on the basis of their heritage. Whether it is built heritage or is their cultural heritage, they have built very successful economies. Heritage. And I think that is what we need to realize. That is what I mean by greater awareness. You don't have to be sentimental about the past only. You have to realize that it is historic and important for us as a society, but for our future development also. Preserving our heritage is very important. So that's what I feel. It's just ignorance, I think.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering this question.
Thank you.
Yes, Hemant, I would like to ask ma'am. We have been, namaste, ma'am.
Namaste.
Long time not seen you. Yeah. So my question is that we are, as usual, we are very complacent with all our problems, and so preserving the heritage is, I think, worst hit because of that. So can something be done where awareness can be created amongst those who matter, who could do something? Can public consciousness arise that? So that was my worry.
Yeah, ultimately, Ushaji, it's just we have to continue to talk about this. We have to continue to talk about it, and sensitizing people. I particularly feel sensitizing young people is so important because they are the decision makers of the future. They are going to make decisions at so many levels. If they are in positions of power, they will make decisions there. They will make decisions in their everyday lives. And it is their decisions which will finally impact us. I think our generation has made a mess of things. And we are looking to the younger generations to do a better job.
Yeah. So that's a very nice message that you give to our youngsters who are here. And especially persons like Hemant, they can definitely lead in the matter. Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have sort of was allotted to us. However, this has been truly a delight listening to you, Swapna ma'am. I now invite Ma'am Suchitra Malavya, the principal of RRMPH school, to propose a vote of thanks.
Namaskar to all. First of all, I would like to thank and congratulate Dr. Swapna ji for her extremely enlightening session. Thank you, ma'am, for taking us to the beautiful heritage tour and let us know about the amazing stories behind these monuments. You have even created interest in students to find all those details about monuments.
Suchitra ma'am, your there is a small issue in your connectivity.
Maybe if you turn off your video.
Am I audible?
Maybe you can
ma'am, there's a small connectivity issue.
Maybe if you can turn off your video, we'll hear your voice better.
Is it okay? Audible? Hello?
Ma'am, can you try
Am I audible?
turning off? Ma'am, can you try turning off your
Just-
video?
Yeah, I have turned it on. I have turned on.
Okay, okay, you may talk. Ma'am, please continue.
Am I audible now?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, as I said, undoubtedly, monuments are not merely buildings. They are the living images of our forefathers who turned their dream projects in their structured form. If we talk about Delhi, some of the eye-catching monuments of the capital, ma'am has beautifully explained in her talk. Delhi, in fact, offers us a complete ancestral dose of history, heritage, culture, and tradition that is being consumed by the people of all generations. Now, it must be our joint venture to unfailing pass on this external legacy to our young generation. Thank you for this beautiful awareness session to educate our youngsters about the importance of these historical monuments. Definitely, the youth will come forward to volunteer themselves for their restoration and conservation. On behalf of all schools, management, teachers, students, and parents, I would like to thank SPICMACE team for giving such strong and huge platform to our young children to listen and interact with such dignitaries. Thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you so much, the whole team of SPICMACE. Would like to have more information for our children, young children, on all these historical slides which you have shown in your session, ma'am. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, because many of the children, they go through the history, but they don't know about behind all the stories. We know only through the words of you people only. So we want that more sessions should be organized through you people also to make the young generation aware of all these kind of things. Thank you to all.
Thank you so very much. I'm extremely grateful to this school, RR Morarka School, and for SPICMACE for this giving me this opportunity to speak. And it's been a delight to interact with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, Swapna, ma'am. With that, we come to the end of this talk. Up next, we have a virtual tour at the National Gallery of Modern Art. And this will be curated by Shri Argha Kamal Ganguly. This will be from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., which will be followed by the valedictory ceremony. After that, we will be having Mr. Stephen Barredieu on he's a renowned violinist of the Western classical music. With that, we come to the end. We thank our supporters, Department of Youth Affairs, Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, Ministry of Culture, Sri Ram Foundation, Ashok Leyland, Takshila Educational Society, Dr. Vikram Seth, and Kusumgar. Thank you.